Hello and welcome to Truss Issues, the podcast where we're tracking the first 100 days of Liz Truss's premiership. We are now about 40 days in, is that right?
Yeah.
And at the beginning we joked about whether we get to 100. Now 50?
I'm not sure we're going to get to 41.
Really? Well, we'll get to that later. Last night was a very dramatic one in Parliament. There's a lot to run through. We released a video this morning on the TLDR UK channel where we ran through the timeline kind of up until yesterday, because that's how animation works. We couldn't do it live. But a lot has happened since then. So we wanted to make this video as kind of an accompaniment to that one, to continue the timeline and kind of outline what's happened since. So, to catch anyone up who's not been following in great detail, yesterday there was a lot of contention surrounding, and this is kind of ludicrous, whether parliamentary control ought to be handed over to Labour on the issue of fracking. Now, that is confusing, but that is confusing because it's confusing, not because of anything else. So essentially, Labour wanted to introduce new legislation which would outlaw fracking, which is controversial within both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. In fact, it was in the Conservative Party's manifesto in 2019 that they wanted to stop fracking. Liz Truss has kind of changed her mind on that. She's more pro-frack, if you want to put it like that. But Labour wants to take control and essentially say, we want a discussion about fracking. So the Conservatives yesterday said, okay, we'll have a vote on whether Labour should be allowed to start a conversation about fracking in the House of Commons.
Exactly.
This wasn't a vote on fracking. This was a vote about a conversation on fracking. So they introduced this vote. They said it will be happening this evening. And that seemed like, okay, fairly normal. However, it eventually ended up becoming a confidence vote. Does one of you two want to take it from there on what confidence votes are and how it ended up becoming a confidence vote rather than a prelude to a conversation about fracking?
Shall I explain how it became a confidence vote?
Yeah,
go
You
for
do
it.
what a confidence vote, all the implications. So it became a confidence vote because while, as you've made clear, it wasn't actually a vote on fracking, the vote was associated with fracking. And as you mentioned, a lot of Tory MPs don't like fracking, and more importantly, a lot of Tory MPs' constituents don't like fracking. So basically, every Tory MP in a constituency where fracking could happen doesn't like fracking because their constituents hate it. You know, if you,
And disproportionately, the places where fracking is going to happen are more Tory seats.
yeah,
because
they're the
countryside.
rural, leafy green sort of, that sort of thing. So a lot of Tory MPs don't like it, which is why they said, even though it's only associated with fracking, not fracking, I can't vote for this. You know, I can't go back to my constituents and have the Labour Party use that tagline on me. You know, I voted for fracking.
Yeah.
So a couple of Tory MPs said, we're not going to vote for this. The Truss government decided that this was politically unpalatable. They couldn't, not lose the vote, they couldn't have that many Tory MPs voting in favour of the Labour Party taking control of the order paper or even abstaining on that matter. So the Truss government, in what's essentially like in a game of poker going all in, you know, went, okay, fine, this is a confidence issue. So if you vote against us, you're essentially expressing no confidence in the government. And typically that means you lose the whip. You're no longer a member of the Conservative Party.
Which is understandably huge.
Yeah, huge news. Yeah. Anyway.
So outline a bit further then what a confidence vote is and what the implications would be for both the government and individual MPs of their decisions.
So the idea with the confidence vote, as Zach sort of alluded to, is it's demonstrating that the government has the confidence of the House and it's able to get its business through the House.
Yeah.
So there's been speculation, you know, we've speculated in the last couple of podcasts about the fact that Liz Truss doesn't have that much confidence in her as a Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So she was sort of, you know, she wanted to try and impose this confidence vote to try and bully some MPs into voting with the government. But also, you know, this would then, as a byproduct of that, demonstrate that Liz Truss can get her business through.
Yes.
The implication being that if the government loses that, it shows they don't have confidence, and that we then spiral into other matters. You know, if the government doesn't have confidence, then there's talk about general elections, about the government falling, etc., etc., etc. For individual MPs, what that means is that you know, they'll have the whip withdrawn if they don't vote with the government.
Yeah.
And what that means is they no longer have the support of their party. So they won't have the financial support if there's an election. They don't get whip. The whole reason it's called having the whip withdrawn is because the Conservative whips don't have any control over them anymore. They don't get the support. They no longer sit as a Conservative MP. They sit as an independent, and the Conservatives choose another candidate for their constituency.
Yeah.
So it's basically the worst form of punishment a government can use against its own MPs.
In reality, you're not only being kicked out of the party, you're kind of being kicked out as an MP because
pretty much,
you're very unlikely to win as an independent unless you've got huge presence within your constituency.
Yeah.
There's got to be very limited examples of you coming out of this alive.
The reason that there is such harsh punishment is because if it's a confidence vote, you're voting, on whether the government can continue governing.
Yeah.
Because if they lose, the expectation is that they call an election and that the government no longer can function in the House.
Yeah.
So the reason that they impose such harsh punishment is because it's such a serious matter.
So this confidence vote was attached to a seemingly semi-irrelevant conversation here. This wasn't a huge defining part of her legislation. There's been other more contentious things that this vote could have been attached to around the budget, around all these kind of things. But it was attached to the initiation of conversation about fracking. And this ended up blowing up as a major issue because they didn't want their own MPs voting against them. So they said, hey, this is a confidence vote. There's big consequences. You have to vote with us. And the hope was that they would vote with them, that it would all go smoothly. You'd get every Conservative MP saying, no, Labour, you can't talk about fracking. You guys shut up about that fracking. And then they could say, hey, look, they're all on our side. Everyone's with us.
It's amazing that you can quote the whips just off the top of your head.
It is. It's almost as if I was in the room.
Yeah.
So as the afternoon went on, things started looking more shaky. It was a confidence vote. They had these really high kind of pressure threats against MPs. But things didn't necessarily go well. Do you want to go through what MPs were saying in the afternoon, at least the more rebellious ones?
Yeah, so you're right. So that's exactly what happened. They threatened a confidence vote. And at least two MPs, I'm not sure if there were any more than that, I don't know if you saw, but at least two Conservative MPs said, I'm still not voting with the government.
Yeah.
And returning to the poker analogy, that's equivalent to the MPs calling Truss's bluff. She's gone all in and they're going, I'm going to match you there. And then we get to the vote itself, or we get to the debate preceding the vote.
Yeah.
The vote was due at 7 p.m, so this debate is sort of like 6 p.m-ish. And Graham Stewart, the climate minister who is representing the government in the House of Commons, was asked by a Conservative MP, is this a confidence vote? And everyone expected him to just say yes. The government has made it clear that it is. Liz Truss said it is. But he stood up and said, of course this is not a confidence issue. And this obviously created a bit of ambiguity. And then another Conservative MP stood up and said, so does that mean we'll have the whip withdrawn, which is usually implied by the confidence issue?
Yeah.
And he couldn't answer that. So he couldn't say whether they get the whip withdrawn. And this, predictably created a fair bit of ambiguity about whether or not this was a confidence issue. And I think the best way to read this here, there's still some dispute over what happened exactly, but the best way to read this here is that Truss realised that a couple of MPs were still going to vote against her on the confidence issue, and she realised that she didn't have the political power to face that. So, if a couple of Conservative MPs essentially expressed no confidence in Truss, she's already teetering. She thought she'd probably collapse. So she thought, oh God, I've got to make sure, I take it back, fine. I take back my money from the poker table.
Yeah.
And then
it's also kind of understandable why these MPs would be making these calls at this point. They're aware that the direction the party's headed, the next election's not going to be pretty.
No.
And these even if they're still running, the attack lines against them around fracking are going to be really damaging in local constituencies. And with national trends moving, they're unlikely to regain their seats anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what is the risk here? Normally the risk is there'll be a new Conservative in your spot and you'll be kicked out. And it's like, well, I'm going to be kicked out anyway.
The interesting thing here is that although she might have pulled back on the confidence vote, she never made that clear.
No.
So the Tory MPs were sat in the chamber. Graham Stewart made that statement about the confidence vote moments before 7 o'clock, before the vote was called. Then the division lobby opened. Yeah. The MPs filtered out of the House of Commons chamber to go and actually vote. And they still unsure about whether it's a confidence vote, which is really important because if you're a Conservative MP and you are opposed to fracking, you don't know what the balance. Do you vote to give Labour control to start this conversation, fearing that you might lose your job, or do you maybe you're not going to lose your job, so maybe you do. It's the actual balance of what you do in that situation. They can't make a rational decision on what the best thing to do is. So they sort of filtered out, and then there were the whips sort of there, and then we get into all sorts of other chaos.
Yeah, so the MPs went out entirely unclear, really, as to whether they were allowed to vote against, whether they wanted to vote against. They were headed to the chambers, and at least according to Chris Bryan, after the event and other MPs, and apparently there's photos, etc., things got a little heated in the lobbies. So, especially for international viewers, when we're talking about people voting, when we're talking about lobbies, we are talking about a physical situation here. They're voting yes or no by literally walking through corridors, the lobbies. This isn't a case of ticking a box, pushing a button. They are physically walking to different rooms and their presence is being counted. So what was happening as they were walking through these rooms or approaching the rooms?
So just to give you an idea, there's the chamber in the middle. They all start filtering out to go and vote. Tory MPs are unclear whether it's a confidence vote. On one side of the House of Commons chamber is a no lobby. On the other side is a yes lobby. So you sort of filter around, you decide which way you want to go. Now, as you say, according to Chris Bryan, he said this after the event, the Conservative MPs filtered out. The whips turn up. The whips' job are to enforce party discipline to make people vote a certain way. They had the chief whip, the deputy chief whip, had resigned moments before the vote had actually happened. So MPs were sort of going up to them asking them how to vote, and they were saying, "I'm not the chief whip anymore. I've just resigned."
Allegedly, one of them going through the corridors shouting, "I don't care anymore."
Yes, that was the deputy chief whip.
This isn't just. Oh, I can't be bothered. Like,
they are seriously.
Massive.
But just to be clear, the whipping operation in the Conservative Party isn't just the chief and the deputy chief whip. They have junior whips who have who are given sort of a number of like maybe 8 or 9 MPs that they sort of look after to try and talk to them and encourage them to vote a certain way. They hadn't resigned. So they were still trying to get people to vote a certain way. And from what we heard last night, I think they were under the impression that it still was maybe a confidence vote. So they were
whipping hard.
Quite forceful. So Chris Bryan had claimed that there was bullying, maybe physically moving Tory MPs into the no lobby to say, no, we don't want Labour to have control of the timetable. Actual bullying taking place, all of this. Jacob Rees-Mogg has been implicated, and Chris Bryan said that he was in some way involved in this. So that had all happened. The government did win the vote. Liz Truss was apparently there. There was some speculation that she didn't vote, and then it turned out that she had voted. I think this was just a quirk of how the counting works. So she did actually vote. But there was a number of Conservatives that just didn't turn up to vote. There was 32.
So before we run through the results itself, I think that whole bullying situation, I mean, it's called whipping, which sounds kind of inherently violent. But this is totally different from things you would ordinarily see. People are calling out examples of when similar things have happened before, and we're not necessarily saying this has never happened before. But it's certainly incredibly rare, and to some extent undermines. Not saying undermines democracy is maybe a little grandiose.
No, I think
but
that's
the whole
appropriate.
point of representative democracy is that you're electing someone who will vote on your behalf, and when that person is maybe being physically manhandled to change their vote, sure, there's whipping, there's encouraging, we'll take away whatever. This is fundamentally different.
I think the modern whipping operation nowadays is very much to do with trying to persuade, convince. Maybe there is an element of saying, maybe being a bit more forceful with language or things like that, but it's mainly just an argument. It's trying to convince someone to vote a certain way with the government, trying to make clear that your responsibilities are to the government as well. If you don't vote a certain way, this might reflect badly on the government. It's a lot to do with trying to just persuade MPs to vote a certain way. Which is reasonable. And when you have a party and you're trying to hold that together, you do need people to try and convince people to vote with the government. That's reasonable. But as you say, when you get into accusations of bullying and physical force, and especially on a vote that was seen beforehand as quite important, especially to do with the Prime Minister's authority, if you're physically moving people into lobbies to vote with you, you've crossed quite a big line.
So they did that allegedly. I don't even know if it's alleged. There's photos, but investigations will take place.
Have we seen the photos?
Isn't going to change
Yes, Chris Bryan released a photo.
Oh, did he?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Doesn't
sure
actually show that much, to be honest. But
I'm sure there'll be more discussion. It's a conversation I'm sure we'll loop back to in other videos, podcasts, whatever. The results came in. The Conservatives did win the vote. The government did win by 94 votes. So not that close in the end. I mean, helped by this kind of ambiguity around whether it's confidence or not. But even still, I mean, 94 votes is a decent majority, but the Conservatives have a huge majority in Parliament. Like, that is still closer than it could have been, and it does leave 32 Conservatives not voting at all. So no one voted against the government. They kind of all obeyed that. But 32 people didn't vote, which, as you said earlier, is enough ordinarily to have the whip removed in a confidence vote. Now, again, was it a confidence vote? Kind of, who knows still. But who are the 32 people? Is there anyone notable in there, or is it just a bunch of local MPs who are upset about fracking?
So there's MPs from all over the sort of different wings of the Conservative Party. So we have Greg Clark, Sir Geoffrey Cox, who sort of goes back to the Theresa May days, David Davis, Nadine Dorries, Boris Johnson, and another former Prime Minister, Theresa May, Kwasi Kwarteng, resigned last week and is already causing problems. Alok Sharma, Ben Wallace, and William Ragg. William Ragg is actually on the 1922 committee as well.
Interesting.
They're all from different sort of parts of the Conservative Party. Then they represent different factions, and it's not like there was one unified movement to not vote. It seems like there was sort of different people from all over.
It sounds like it was chaos. All of it.
Absolute chaos. Yeah.
So, government won. This was meant to show unity and confidence in the government. I think it profoundly hasn't. I mean, it does mean that Labour won't get this opportunity to talk about fracking, which I guess is a disappointment for them and people who care about environmental causes.
Labour will be pretty happy
but
about
I was about to say, I think they'll be upset that fracking wasn't brought up, but in their list of priorities, I don't want to besmirch their environmental credentials, but I think Labour care about some other things more than this actual conversation about fracking. One kind of thread that we kind of got lost in the mix is we were saying that the Chief Whip and Deputy Chief Whip both resigned before the vote. They then unresigned, which I didn't know was a thing you could do. But do we know any more about that, or is that still kind of up in the air what actually happened?
I think we don't know. They've apparently unresigned. Number 10 claims they unresigned. And shouting, I don't care anymore. I don't know if it's an official resignation. It gives resignation vibes. I don't know if it really counts as handing in your form, but
I do like that there's probably a lot of people across the country who want to resign, who really want to be able to say something like that, and they've managed to say that and somehow still keep their job.
There's a lot of ambiguity about. I mean, you're right. There's ambiguity about which ministers are still ministers. Mm-hmm. There's also ambiguity still about whether or not it was a confidence vote. So this gives you again pretty Celtic vibes. At 1:30 a.m., Number 10 sent a WhatsApp text to all Tory MPs saying this was indeed a confidence issue and that people who abstained would be punished accordingly. And then this morning, again, this is all, we're recording this in the morning, so this is all subject to change. I think it was an environment minister was on the airwaves saying, no, this was not a confidence issue. So, Liz Truss sending out desperate texts at 1:30 a.m. and then sending her mates out to say, I take it back. It's giving off very, very Celtic vibes. And no one really knows whether or not it was a confidence issue. I think at the end of the day, whatever Number 10 claims about that vote, the political reality is that Truss does not have the political capital to fire 32 Conservative MPs.
Especially considering listening to the list. I mean, they might not be ministers, many of them, if any of them, but they're certainly really high-profile people. If she kicks out 2 former prime ministers, her chancellor up until last week, like a bunch of other high-profile people. That's wild. Like, I'm not saying it couldn't happen. Johnson kicked out a bunch of people, but not this high-profile and not this many. Exactly.
The Nadine Dorries would kill her in her sleep if she kicked out Johnson.
She'd be kicked out too, though.
I know in the last episode you talked about this sort of like decision tree of shit, effectively. And I feel like her options now are either kick out 32 Conservative MPs, which she just she can't do. She physically can't do that. The other option though is to let them remain in, having said that it's a confidence vote, which almost sets the precedent that you can vote against the government on a confidence, or you can abstain on a confidence vote and keep the whip. Like you're diminishing.
Or she can pretend it wasn't a confidence vote, which again undermines her credibility because she literally said it.
Exactly. There is then backtracking on that. It's just all awful. It's just every decision she could make here is awful.
What decision do you think she is going to make, and what do you think the implications of that are?
I think she's inevitably going to say it wasn't a confidence vote.
Okay. Going to try weasel tactics?
Yeah, but I think insofar as she really has a choice, I think at this point it's just so clear, not just to the 1922 committee, who are what matters in this situation, but also to Parliament and to the general public, that she doesn't command the support of the House or a majority of Tory MPs. And I think that today, maybe latest tomorrow, the 22 committee are going to find a way to get rid of her. So whatever she says is sort of by the by. It's slightly redundant. She has to go after this. I mean,
it is amazing how every time she seems to stand up for something she believes in, like she likes fracking, it just all goes terribly, and she's told you can't do that.
Every time she stands up.
That is also true.
Yeah, it's true.
We should talk, if we have time, do you want to You've got a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes.
Thank you, very kind. I think the only thing, and Ben actually knows more about this than I do, but the only thing that's interesting here is once they get rid of her, there is consensus amongst Tory MPs that they can't do a membership vote as they did last time around. But then that means that a majority of Tory MPs have to express their support for some other candidate. And I don't know. And I don't know if there is an obvious candidate. I mean, there's a lot of talk about a Sunak-Mordaunt double act, but they haven't explicitly said they'll agree to that. And then if they don't run together, is there a majority in favour of Sunak? Is there a majority in favour of Mordaunt? Is there a majority in favour of Johnson or maybe Suella Braverman? I mean, there's not. But my point is more that without a clear majority,
we're going to end up with a coalition of chaos of Conservative leaders. We're going to end up with like a weird amalgam of former prime ministers, and Theresa May, chuck her in there too.
There was a lot of talk in the last few days about, obviously, Rishi, maybe Penny Mordaunt, maybe Boris Johnson. But then I think yesterday I saw quite a lot of journalists saying that the Johnson faction wouldn't allow Sunak to come back. The Sunak faction wouldn't allow Johnson to come back. So that
the Braverman faction
doesn't exist.
Well, it does. There definitely is a constituency within the Parliamentary Party for Braverman. The far right will be backing behind Braverman. That's what she's been positioning herself for the last couple of weeks.
I think
there's more than you think.
There's more than you think, but there's clearly not enough.
But it could be enough to stymie a majority.
Yes, absolutely.
It could be a sort of like 2010 when you have a couple of Lib Dems in the middle, and that means we have to go for a coalition. So I was basically going to ask you, Ben, what happens if they can't find a majority for one candidate? Do you know what happens? Is that a general election?
I mean, that is the only way I can see that being resolved. I think if there's no candidate that they can then present to the king to become prime minister, because ultimately the king invites the leader of the party to. If they can't decide on a leader of the party, he then has to try and find someone who he believes can command confidence in the House. If he doesn't believe that that's the case, then his only option is to dissolve Parliament. Really,
which would be wild.
Which would be
the
a
king
general
getting
election.
Involved. He's
General
barely
election.
been there 10 minutes. He's not even been coronated yet, and he's already dealing with all this.
Well, just to be clear, he isn't yet. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're right. It's a very real possibility.
He's shining his shoes, ready for it. He's ready for a big announcement.
I'm starting to, because last week, and when we've done the last couple of episodes, it seems to be Truss is going to go and they'll just choose another leader. But you are right. The more we think about this and the more you actually look at the state of the Conservative Party currently, it's becoming unbelievable that they'd be able to all agree on a candidate. And if they can't agree on a candidate, the only thing that can happen at that point, if they can't present an a prime minister to the king, is a general election.
Can you imagine that? Imagine how bad the general election would be for the Tories. I mean, it's literally like giving the public a revolver and saying, "Put us out of our misery." It's appalling.
But that's it. That is where we're at now. It's sort of watching this in slow motion, and all I can think is, who is this? Just they need to get out of their misery.
That's why I asked you. I thought you'd be able to tell me.
I think this also does just bring to light yet again, in a lot of these situations, there's not a clear answer. For good or bad, this is how our political system works. We don't have the kind of built-in controls and mechanisms that a lot of countries do. We have protocols, we have understandings, whatever. And I don't know if other countries will be able to handle this either. But it's hard to imagine that under a more kind of American system, which clearly has its own issues, they've got much more of a formula of how this person's here until then, and then this, and then it goes to the vice president. Like, we just aren't, there's no process here.
We just have please king sort it out.
One other very quick thing, just as another possibility, I think, is that if they get rid of Truss and they can't present a unity candidate, I reckon what could happen is you just see a number of Tory MPs just standing, not wanting a leadership election, almost expecting them to be the only. So maybe Sunak standing, expecting himself to be the only candidate, someone else standing as well, and we just sort of default into another Tory leadership election.
What about we're talking about bringing people back. Let's get like John Major in.
Which would be
old
awful
bloke.
If there's another leadership election. But I almost feel like it might, if they can't rally around one person, multiple people are going to stand, and we sort of default into one.
But I think that's constitutionally an ambiguous position, because they haven't expressed. Normally in a leadership election, the prime minister is leader until the new leader is elected, and if Truss doesn't command the support of the House, so it's implausible really to claim that she's still prime minister once Sunak has essentially declared his candidacy. So what happened? Do we have a prime minister at that point? And then you put the king in a really difficult position constitutionally.
We had a bad situation over the summer when there was a lot to deal with, cost of living wise, whatever, and Johnson was kind of a lame duck prime minister through all of that. But at least he had some authority to do something.
And he was clearly the prime minister.
Whereas if Truss goes out after this, she's no longer the prime. She's basically no longer the prime minister already.
No.
It's an absolute.
They've got big
I
old
don't know
trust
what's
issues.
going to happen. I honestly don't know what's going to
Where's
happen.
the camera?
The last thing I think is really interesting. It's a really cool article. I can't remember who it's by. That's doing the rounds at the moment. But a lot of the time, if this were to happen, it would put the king in a very difficult position constitutionally. And we've sort of not worried about that too much over the last 80 years because obviously the Queen was wary of getting involved in politics. And you sort of knew what she was going to do. She was going to sort of take the path of least resistance, try and leave it up to Parliament as much as possible. You don't know if the king is similarly inclined. He might be a more active constitutional monarch. And no one really knows, and this is the first test. So I think that we're all treating this quite sort of... I mean, obviously it's chaos and terrible, but this could, depending on how Charles reacts, this could mark a significant redrawing of our code of the Constitution.
He's a big environmentalist, so maybe we'll just appoint Caroline Lucas, just straight up. He won't.
The coronation no one expected.
Okay, that's all we have time for today. We can say we don't know in as many ways as we like, but we still don't know.
No one knows.
And realistically, we'll be back before we know it. And I think ultimately we were concerned that this podcast would die with Truss. But I think, as we've outlined, the Truss issues continue. Like, it might not be Truss that's causing the issues directly anymore, but the aftermath of this and the continuation of this is clearly a while off. Yeah. So while we do need to start thinking about some new punny names, I think Truss issues will serve us for a little bit longer.
We've just got to see whether she's still Prime Minister by the next episode.
Bets, yes or no?
No. Strong no.
Also no. I actually don't think so.
We'll see you then.